I thought I'd do a quick video from a historical perspective on war crimes. I don't want to make it too long, so I'll be quite specific here. But the point of this is we've seen in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, everybody in the Western media, the popular media, is denouncing almost everything as a war crime. And we need to be a little bit careful to actually look at these one by one and say, is this a war crime? Is this a legitimate act of war? And we must be careful not to take a moral high ground, because we've done plenty of things ourselves in the West, and because of our preeminent position, or at least America's, sanctions have not really been an option. And I'm sure we've done plenty of things that would have been worthy of them, and a lot else. So let's not take a position of moral high ground. Let's analyse things individually. What can we say has happened? What hasn't happened? And I'll give you an example. We saw these pictures. I think even Vladimir Klitschko put up a picture showing this civilian mall, very large mall in Kiev, that had lots of just civilian cars in the car park, a shopping mall, and it had been struck with, I don't know what, but the whole place was burnt out. So it had been heavily struck with either bombs from the air or artillery or cruise missiles. Not entirely sure what struck it, but the whole place was smashed up. And there were no signs of any military vehicles or military paraphernalia kind of smashed up there. So it appears they just targeted a civilian mall, and this was the reaction. This is a war crime. All they've done is targeted civilians who are going out to try and buy their food. However, it later emerges that some very naive, incautious fool, who I believe was a foreign volunteer to fight for Ukraine, did his surrogate country a real disservice, because a few hours before he'd taken a picture of himself standing in front of that mall, and you could see all of these large Ukrainian army trucks, kind of logistics trucks, that were underneath the mall, so hidden from aerial observation. They're in the kind of, not underground parking lot, but beneath, which you call it, mezzanine or whatever. No, they were hidden from view from above. And he'd very foolishly taken this photo and uploaded it. And of course, with the Russians, with all their intelligence assets, all their electronic intelligence assets, the open source intelligence assets, they'd seen this picture. Now, even if on his phone he turned off the various geolocation features and stuff, so maybe that wasn't in the metadata of the picture, it doesn't matter, because it was so obvious where it was. And these people that are taking these pictures, firstly, they just shouldn't be doing it. But secondly, when they are doing it, do not photograph build-up of troops, your own troops, in front of notable landmarks, because they get struck by artillery if you do. They get attacked. But the point of this video, that's just an aside, a bit of advice when you listen to it, but that was why it was struck, because it was being used for military purposes. They were hiding logistics trucks under there. It was a genuine military target. And that came out later. And unfortunately, that idiot, he has blood on his hands in my book, because he took that photo, uploaded it for anybody to see, including the Russians, and 4 people were killed in that attack. There were different examples, as I mentioned before, of tank commanders, at least 2 of them, blatantly murdering civilians. And that's very different. If you see a civilian wandering across a square and your tank's just parked up and he's holding his hands in the air, ambling along, clearly not got any sort of missiles, not a javelin on him, has he? And he's not carrying a bazooka. He's got his hands in the air. He's an old man hobbling across the square, and they blast him with their main armour. That's a murder. That's a war crime. But similarly, when you put your captured Russian soldiers up on television and broadcast that, making them talk about themselves and, why they're there, what they're doing, that's a war crime. Unless those people have volunteered and said, I really, really want to go on television to tell everybody about the terrible things happening, it's a war crime sticking them up. You don't do that. And the fact that so many of them were having these messages broadcast, and even did a press conference, we had about 6 of them there, I don't think they have much choice about doing that. And certainly by the looks of some of them, they didn't appear to be very happy being there. Now, they did not look brutalised, I'll say that much. There was one that, out of the press conference, had the 6, there was one that had black eyes, but then again, I think his tank got shot. And so he could well have been thrown about and, had his face smashed when he was abandoning his tank. as well. So, we can't take sides here. We just pick out individual incidents and call them out if they're wrong. As well, we need to be very careful when we're interpreting how the battle is going, how different sides are doing, because the Russian side is not putting out very much information at all, because we know from the troops that were interviewed, they've taken all their cell phones off them by and large. I'm sure the commanders still have theirs, but also in Ukraine, all the Russian SIM cards won't work, so they don't have immediate access to the internet, so they can't upload these little videos even if they wanted to. Although I have heard of Ukrainian girls doing it's a little bit what some of the French resistance did, where they would the girls would pretend to date Nazis and get them up into a bedroom and then kill them. There's quite a few accounts of girls working for resistance doing this, and it's a little bit like that. We've heard of some Ukrainian girls going on to Tinder and then linking up with Russian officers who really want a Ukrainian girl, because apparently they're statistically the most attractive girls in the world, according to at least one survey, and then using the geolocation function on Tinder to then get these people struck with artillery or drones. I've heard that now a few times, so, that's another thing. But the other thing, in terms of, these videos that are going up, we need to be very careful, because most of these videos are little cam snippets. The ones that are action, anyway, the ones that have been taken from drones, they're little snippets. So what you see is something firing off, then you see an explosion, and then usually it just cuts out, or many of them just cuts out. Then there are some where the clip's longer, and previously we've only seen the edited one where you see the bang on the tank, for example. There's one where you see tanks on a main road, I think it's coming into Kiev, and then somebody uses an anti-tank missile of some description from the side, from sort of the woods from the side, hits the tank, and there's an explosion, and it was cut out. However, it cuts out after the explosion. However, if you look at the longer clip, you see that tank actually drives off. The explosion you saw was the reactive explosive armour, explosive reactive armour that is designed to defend against those attacks, and it works. That's why the thing blew up. The tank didn't cook off. And then we see further clips, little bits snipped out, and then eventually you see the tank actually blowing up. But interestingly, at least in one of those clips, you see it initially hit, and then afterwards you see a slight skip in the footage, and then you see the whole thing cooking off. But between the edits, you'll notice the gun turret has moved, and then when the tank blows up, the actual explosion, the smoke and fire, as well as coming out the turret, it also comes out the gun barrel. Now, why would it puff out of the gun barrel? The reason is the breech of the gun barrel's open. So presumably that tank is being fired. So between the first clip and the second clip, it could well be they fired a shot or several shots, the gun barrel's been opened again, or the breech rather has been opened, and then they've been struck again, the ammunition's cooked off, and hence why the blast comes out all the way through the gun barrel. And so be very careful looking at these clips where you just see a very, very short clip and then a bit of fire, because it could well be that this active armour that the Russian tanks have is actually quite effective. And we're only getting primarily one side of it, the Ukrainian side, for the reasons I've outlined. But I just wanted to go back in history, just because it's something I heard. I've been listening to Aces Falling, which is a book, I think it's from 2007, by Peter Hart, who's primarily a World War I historian, although he does all kinds of history, World War II as well. And he's retired now from the Imperial War Museum, but he was working in oral history there. So what he would do, he'd go out and interview veterans. He'd interview veterans for World War I, because he was there about 20 years. He'd go and interview veterans for World War II. And he'd do sometimes over 100 hours of interviews with them. And obviously, by the time he was doing it, the World War I veterans, most of them were not quite so lucid anymore because they're quite old. World War II ones, totally lucid at the time. But this was an interview. I don't know if he did it or someone else, but I'm just going to summarise it. And I want you guys to think, is this a war crime? Was he right? Was he wrong? It was Captain Harold Balfour, who was a scout pilot. I don't have the date. I don't have the precise location. That's not in there, at least in the book that I'm reading. But it's on the Western Front, and on the Western Front, you must understand that observation is carried out both by observation aircraft that have a pilot and an observer in them. And why are they observing? Well, they're looking for things like troop movements and, taking photographs behind the lines of where all the critical bits of the enemy machine is. But also, a big role, perhaps the most important one, the reason why they're there, is artillery spotting. So they're connected up to a gun battery, not connected literally, but wirelessly. And what they're doing, they're looking for where the battery shot falls, and then they're correcting it. And they have like a clock face kind of thing that they can send back in Morse code, saying 100 yards, too far north. 25 yards south, spot on pretty much. And they can correct the fall of artillery. And they're the ones doing the real killing. But as well as having those observation aircraft, they also used a great deal of observation balloons. So these are balloons, you would sort of tie them onto a heavy truck, and there'd be an electric winch. Actually, it's electric, I think it might have been diesel. But anyway, it was a winch. And they were filled with hydrogen, lighter than air, and they would float them up in the air, and they can do their observation, and they would do the artillery spotting. So a battery, they'd be connected down that winch cable, there'd also be a telephone line, and they could talk to the battery, and they would observe the fall of shot, and they'd correct it and put them onto the right target of where the enemy battery is, and then make sure that it ultimately falls on them. And taking down those balloons was an important job, and it was dangerous. They used to call the people that went up in them ballonatics, at least behind their backs. They were equipped with parachutes, so when they were attacked, if their balloon was put up in flames, which it would do very easily, it would very easily flame up, they could jump with these fairly primitive parachutes, but I think they usually worked. I think 19 out of 20 times they worked, something like that. But anyway, on this day, and both sides had these, of course, I mean, they date back, even the American Civil War, artillery spotting balloons were used, back in the 1860s. So, but on this day, it's Captain Harold Balfour, and he's coming back from patrol, and it's clear sky. He's about 9,000 feet. He sees a balloon on the opposite side, an enemy balloon, about 3,000 feet, and he starts flying towards it. And he's getting nearer and nearer. And then he suddenly thinks, actually, I've not been told to attack balloons today. And he knows by experience from what everybody's told him, they're heavily defended, and the Germans have a great deal of heavy flak all around them. Big cannon shells, not just machine gun bullets. They were a very hard target. You had to be very brave to go balloon busting against the Germans. Much more heavily defended than our ones were. So he thinks better of it. He's sort of come down a bit. Everybody's seen him now. It's great, perfect visibility. He said you can see 15 miles. But then he swings around, starts to come back towards his own lines, and then he just feels this pang of guilt in his stomach. So he's a captain, so he's quite highly ranked, and he thinks everybody's watching me, the troops on the ground, our own balloon corps people, they've all seen me, and they're going to be thinking, what a coward, Why has he turned away? We're risking our lives going up there. We're getting shelled by enemy artillery in our balloons, we're getting attacked by enemy aircraft, and you're too cowardly to attack them. And so, with all of this pressing on his conscience, he swings back again, knowing that he's in the crucible, everyone's watching him. And he goes for the balloon, 3,000 feet. He says there's lots of bullets flying past him and everything, but miraculously he's not hit. He gets up very close, as you have to do, and he has tracer ammunition in his gun, which is obviously hot and fiery, and it will rip it's a fairly small balloon, it'll rip it to shreds, and it will fire it. And so, he rakes a machine gun fire, the balloon bursts into flames, and the observer jumps out, and his parachute immediately kind of folds out. They're a bit different to modern parachutes, So he's just there, and for 3,000 feet, you're going to float down quite slowly, that observer will. And as he flies past, he suddenly thinks, well, this balloon is just made of rubber and silk, and it's not very valuable. The thing that's valuable is that observer, because, he's been trained. He's taken months to train. He might have years of experience. He knows where artillery is. He's a danger to our men on our side because, he knows where he's the person that is in the know. He can direct their battery fire right where it's going to kill our men. And he thinks that observer's got to be killed. And so he manages to slow the plane down, swing it around, and then he says he rakes 100 rounds or so of machine gun fire into that observer and his parachute. He says he doesn't know how many shots hit, but he was just raking the dude. So he knows that he killed him. Anyhow, he lands and that he's expecting praise for destroying a balloon because it would count as one victory, destroying an observation balloon. Instead, we don't get the reaction from his own squadron, his own men, but apparently the observer balloon corps are absolutely furious, and they're sending him abusive messages and really having a go at him, because the reason is, now that he's done that, word will get around. And so no doubt now, when they bail out of their balloons, which are much less defended, so they're bailing out of them all the time, they're always getting shot down, now probably the Germans will start shooting us. And so apparently for months, the name of Captain Harold Balfour, it stinks in the balloon corps. It's kind of how he puts it. However, even when he's telling about this story, he doesn't express any regrets. He still thinks that was the right thing to do. And you could argue, yes, it was the right thing to do. It's the same over England during the Battle of Britain. Every German pilot that goes down is captured. So it's a loss of a pilot. We were producing abundant numbers of fighter aircraft, Hurricanes and Spitfires, during the Battle of Britain. That wasn't the issue. It was always about pilots. And so you could argue that a German tactic should really have been shooting pilots. But as far as I'm aware, that rarely happened, if ever. I heard one story of that happening over Malta, where an enemy aircraft, a German aircraft, deliberately, according to the Observer, which was Laddie Lucas at the time, famous ace over there, deliberately flew just in such a way past the parachute that his slipstream caused the parachute to crumple up and the man to fall to his death. Then, in revenge, they waited for a German aircraft to crash and their pilots to bail out and get into a rubber dinghy. I think it might have crashed on the water and they got in a rubber dinghy. And they, in revenge, just machine gunned the rubber dinghy. And so, it's one of those ones where, from a military point of view, it makes perfect sense, shooting that observer pilot, or observer balloonist, rather. But was it a war crime? Again, and so this is what we've got to assess. There's some things, as I said, like the direct murder of civilians, but there are other times where we may well not have anything like the full picture. The way Chieftain explained it, who's a tank colonel in the US Army, it sounds like he's Irish to me, but he's in the US Army. He said sometimes you can only see the tree or even the bark of the tree and not the forest. And so there's a lot of things that we don't know. And as Rumsfeld famously said, there's the known unknowns and there's the unknown unknowns. And, so we need to be a little bit careful about moral opprobrium at this stage from what we're seeing. End of video.